So next up, podcast listeners, Tim Scott goes on The View. So United States Senator Tim Scott went on The View to respond to offensive comments that The View made about Tim Scott, saying that, he was kind of like an Uncle Tom because he's a black Republican. It's what Democrats do. So in The Blaze, Senator Tim Scott appeared on the talk show The View, to combat comments made by the show's hosts just 2 weeks prior that he didn't quite grasp what it's like to be black in the United States. Of course, as you know, Tim Scott is a black United States senator from South Carolina. Despite being a black man himself, Scott also called the remarks that his life was an exception to black people, not a rule, dangerous and disgusting. Well, of course, as you all know, ladies and gentlemen, if you are a black Republican, then you don't know how bad it is for other people who are black. It's just so old. Host Joy Behar recently claimed that Scott and other black Republicans didn't acknowledge systemic racism to the degree that she believes they should, and implied that pulling yourself up by your bootstraps was an unrealistic viewpoint. In other words, if you're black and you're in America, you have no chance of ever going anywhere. This is exactly Marxism, right? Because you don't want people to go anywhere. You don't want there to be classes that move from one to the other. That is, you don't want people to move up and you don't want people to move down. What you really want is for everybody to be equally poor. And then, of course, you have the elites that run everything. They're special. They get all the special privileges. You get nothing. Quote, he's one of these guys who, he's like Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, a black Republican who believes in pulling yourself by your bootstraps rather than, to me, understanding the systemic racism that African Americans face in this country and other minorities face, Behar said. Scott recently announced that he was running for president and appeared on The View on June 5th, 2023. Keep in mind, that was just this week. Keep in mind, ladies and gentlemen, that, since Tim Scott is running for president of the United States and he's black and he's Republican, he is a complete and utter threat to the narrative of the Democrat Party. There can't be black Republicans. And if there are, well, the Republicans keep them down. They can't ever run for president or anything really high. Tim Scott's a United States Senator. Quite frankly, the best political job in the United States is to be a U.S. Senator because you serve for 6 years, right? That's a long time. You don't have to run again, assuming that you would, or whatever the case may be, for another 6 years after you get elected. And the president of the United States is only 4 years. Really, the best job is United States Senator. And so Tim Scott is a U.S. Senator from South Carolina, and the left thinks, well, we have to destroy him because he's a Republican and he's black. So therefore, that's exactly what Behar and The View want to do. I think this is important because I always say the same thing, which is who actually watches The View? But they do have an audience. And part of their audience is to stir up things. That's why they have an audience. They stir up, I think, racism, and they try to keep racism alive. It's really sick what they do. However, the article continues, Behar did not appear on the episode for his rebuttal. They intentionally, The View, the producers, did not have Joy Behar on there because they didn't want her to have to face the music with Tim Scott. Instead, co-host Sunny Hostin, who is black, had the most contentious exchange with the South Carolina politician. Quote, you have indicated that you don't believe in systemic racism, Hostin asked. What is your definition of systemic racism? Quote, Tim Scott, one of the reasons I'm on the show is because of the comments that were made, frankly, on the show, and the only way for an African-American kid to be successful in this country is to be the exception and not the rule, Scott began. That is a dangerous, offensive, and disgusting message to send to our young people today, that the only way to succeed is by the exception. I will tell you that in my life, the exception, I can't even imagine it, Scott continued, before Hostin interrupted him. And then Scott, of course, had to say to Hostin, just let me finish. Because the View simply cannot allow Tim Scott to have a conversation with their viewers. And that really goes to the overall media as a whole, right? They really can't allow true, in-depth, long source conversations to occur. And we're going to get to that later in this podcast about one particular social media company that does allow it. The mainstream media, the legacy media, can't allow it because they have a narrative. And by the way, that probably includes the Republicans in some cases, and the Democrats have a narrative. So Tim Scott also had a question, and it was from the young lady. I think it was Salazar. I always forget her name. She's on The View. She's Hispanic, and she lives in Florida. We can look her up. I'm not really sure. Whoopi Goldberg had to shut down Tim Scott's comments because he was so effective. So Whoopi Goldberg initially was saying on The View, everybody don't boo Tim Scott, because the audience at The View, they were booing Tim Scott's comments. And then Whoopi, to her credit, said, look, at The View, we let everybody have a conversation, which isn't really true at all. Okay. So it made Whoopi look good for a moment until such time as Tim Scott really started getting in the groove and explaining himself. And then Whoopi said, oh, we got to go to commercial. And she was actually going like this and waving to the producer in the back of the room. And the cameraman quickly panned away from her because it accidentally caught her going, oh yeah, okay, like I'll shut it down. She shuts it down and then goes right to commercial because Tim Scott was doing so well. We have an exchange here with Tim Scott and this young lady on The View. It's pretty fantastic. It's about a minute long, and here it is.
So I think protecting our kids from the indoctrination that's happening in our culture today is an important part of the equation. I'd also go a step further and say, listen, from the radical left is getting involved from a corporate perspective on a number of issues, to include, which was the Georgia state law that was supposedly the Jim Crow 2.0. And the fact of the matter is that when we look at the results of the last election, what we saw was not Jim Crow 2.0. What we saw was an actual record-breaking number of African Americans not only voting, but also succeeding at the ballot box.
Do you think weaponizing government against the private sector, against private businesses for exercising their First Amendment right to say something, to have an opinion, is a conservative position? I
do not. I think that the fact of the matter is that the First Amendment, every single person should exercise their First Amendment rights. If they don't like what's happening with the corporation, stop shopping there.
Exactly.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's what we're going to do right
Mickey
now.
Mouse is not radical.
We say thank you for coming today.
So Tim Scott was just getting into the groove and gaining momentum to provide his point of view. And then Whoopi Goldberg was like, oh, well, we got to go to commercial. But what was funny is the question to Tim Scott was, do you believe in the First Amendment? Do you believe corporations have a right to have a say in social issues and in issues generally speaking? And remember, Target is an actual corporation that is owned by shareholders. They actually are supposed to be making money for shareholders. Technically, they're not supposed to be getting involved in these things. They can if they want to, but they're going to probably have a shareholder lawsuit. So Tim Scott gets a question about, well, do you believe in the First Amendment? And he tries to give his answer, and he's not able to because Whoopi Goldberg's like, well, speaking of First Amendment, we got to go to commercial. We have to cut off Tim Scott because we can't let people hear what he has to say because we actually don't support the First Amendment on The View. It's just so transparently obvious. And I'm hoping, I know that you folks, for the most part, see this out there in podcast land for Mark and the Millennials, but I'm hoping that the people that actually watch The View get it too, right? Do they not understand how stupid these people are? Well, we're going to give you the First Amendment, right? Do you believe in the First Amendment? Well, yeah, let me explain why. Oh, we got to go to a commercial. Sorry, can't do that. Incredible. And that is Tim Scott on The View.